practically inevitable, then you go for the rule. That is interesting. Take it from me. If you're a lawyer, you're trying to work out what to do you go for a decision against your client, or do you go for the rule that drives the decision against your client? It matters whether you can do the second, especially if you're trying to achieve a big win for more than just yourself. So the big case today, Adam might have something to say about that. I don't know. I haven't read it. Similar question. This is near the end. Similar question. Not been really discussed or argued. Don't worry about trying to absorb all that. Statute does that balance. Stuff happens under the statute as a result of a balance the statute took on, say, privacy versus freedom of expression, or economic efficiency versus freedom of expression or something. To what extent do you accept the balance done by Parliament as governing all the little things done under authority of Parliament and turning everything done under it into convention compatibility? And to what extent do you not? It's a complicated way of putting it, but here's the simpler way. Housing Act decides when you can throw people out of their home without any judicial scrutiny. Balances the right to privacy against the right of others to lead kind of quiet lives. British courts, the balance is done by the Housing Act. So everything done under it is compatible with the convention, so therefore there's no breach. 3-2. Lady Hale and Lord Bingham dissented. Goes to Strasbourg, they say, no, you're wrong. Every single case needs to be looked at. That's the point I'm making. Here, sometimes Strasbourg allows it, sometimes they don't. And the it they allow is to immunise decisions under a statute from further judicial scrutiny for human rights grounds on the basis that the statute itself gets the balance right. Tricky stuff. The more you are analysing the proportionality of a rule as opposed to the action under the rule, the closer it looks to legislative intervention. Because you're saying, oh, the rule you just don't like it, as opposed to the implementation of the rule. And finally, on this head of striking out, so striking out your own, you've got the section 6(2)(b) thing, you've got the proportionality thing, and now you've got damages. Damages is the one to watch. Damages. Damages is what matters. And the human rights guys were fiercely opposed to having any kind of damages head, and it's in there in the Human Rights Act, and it could be growing. Look at Infinis, a very bright lawyer, recharacterises a public law case involving the deprivation of a license on a ground that was admitted to be an error of law as a breach of property rights under the Article 1 of the First Protocol. They get over £1 million. I can't remember how much, but they get a lot. Quantifiable damages like that are immense. And then you think of Cliff Richards, made quite a bit out of the BBC's helicopter. So in the English system, unlike the continental, the momentum of damages is upwards, because it's damages that we do. So keep an eye on that one. It'll grow, I'd say, because practitioners will become aware of its value. Certainly in the case I'm doing, a lot of damages flow from the declaration if we win. Concluding thoughts. First one, already anticipated. The Human Rights Act goes with the grain of the common law. That's my big picture take home. It's not been co-opted. That's unfair. It goes with the grain of the common law. Equips the judges to assert that which they'd want, to fill gaps in the common law, but doesn't destabilise the common law. Destabilises some statutes, but the statutes the judges wanted destabilising. 2, I like this about it. It has simplified legal reasoning, and not only because they're all numbered paragraphs now. No idea what it was like before there were numbered paragraphs. Really complicated. And the judges have this lovely neutral citation system. It's actually simplified legal reasoning as well. If you think it's hard now, imagine what it was hard in the 1970s or 80s. You read the judgments without even knowing who was the majority. Will it survive? For question and answer, I think, because we're running out of my time. I think, however, it will survive. And this is why. The disease of Euroscepticism in this country focused first on Maastricht. And then, after 1997, when Tony Blair won for Labour its great victory, the second Labour Party person to win an election since 1950, I'm sure. They focused on human rights. And they found the case of Hearst, which is the prisoner of voting case, which I'm sure the Strasbourg judges would say now is a kind of mistake. Because under no system would he ever have got a vote. And they turned the human rights thing, the convention, into their latest anti-European causes belly. And you need to know, and people forget now because time moves on, in 2005, 2006, being in favour of leaving the European Union was a lunatic position. It was thought to be lunatic. And so the people who wanted to leave, the mad people, focused on the court, the European Court of Human Rights, and the Human Rights Act as easier enemies. And even when the former Prime Minister Theresa May made her one speech against Brexit, which is a haunting, horrifying, terrifying speech in terms of the security implications of the Brexit that will happen in January in all likelihood, she said, I want to leave the Council of Europe. So in order to demonstrate she hated Europe peoples, and her desire to remain should not be mistaken for any love of these Johnny foreigners, she actually wanted to join Belarus as outwit the Council of Europe within Europe. It being too left-wing for her, notwithstanding that Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan had no problems with it. So it's lost that value as a proxy war now that the Brexit people have taken on the real enemy and are, of course, obviously being whipped. But they've become afraid. And I think the Human Rights Act will survive. I think the European Convention will definitely survive, because when Britain pathetically, desperately seeks some kind of deal to stop its continued bankruptcy, that will be one of the conditions. It already is in the withdrawal agreement. So the paradox of Brexit is to confirm Britain's membership of the Council of Europe. And rather sadly, I'm slightly editorializing, last point, rather sadly, the poor old Foreign Office is regarding the Council of Europe as a big priority, because they're running out of international institutions that they can. All right, we'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think your 60 minutes start right now.
Okay, so I've been asked to be discussant on this. What Conor described as just fill the silence before the first.
I did not. You said that yourself.
Before the first question. So the headline, I guess, is that this is Conor supporting the Human Rights Act. So it turns 21 to the sound of Conor making supportive noises, and I turned 21 reading Conor railing against the introduction of the Human Rights Act. So there's a certain symmetry here. Now, the most I can say is I quite like the Human Rights Act. I'm not passionate about it, but it's the best attempt at doing the things it does that's ever been proposed in my lifetime. So I kind of welcome the noise of Conor offering it his support. And I just want to point out a couple of things about the support we've just heard, that maybe then we can talk about some other stuff after that. The first thing is that Conor's support, and this was even more obvious in the presentation than in the paper version, is, to say the least, reluctant or hedged. Okay, so some of the slides we just went through didn't seem like slides that would feature in a supportive account of the Human Rights Act. But what did you say? You said, I was more or less wrong, so this isn't a wholehearted changing of position. And the basic argument he's just presented is the support is because the difficulties he anticipated have been resolved fairly sensibly, which is not a booming endorsement of the Act. So there's my first thing. It's reluctant, this support. And the second thing, and this is more substantial, is I can't help suspecting that the defence we've just heard, Conor's new defence, is less principled than the scepticism that you started with. So the defence we heard today is a less principled defence than the attack was 21 years ago. And I just want to flag that up in a couple of ways. I'll pick up on two of the things that you talked about just now. Now, the first one is the common law argument, as Conor called it, and in particular, so I'll go out of my depth here, the criminal law bit of the common law argument. And we heard that the Human Rights Act has given the common law an ally in its battle with the executive and legislative branches for dominance, that we've seen a growing legislative engagement in criminal procedure which hasn't been well received by the senior judiciary, and Conor sees it as a good thing that the Human Rights Act has equipped the courts to resist this unwelcome legislative intrusion. So what bothers me here is that hiding in the idea of the common law, actually what the argument is that Conor doesn't like that legislation as an outcome, and he likes that the courts have a resource to resist it, and it's only hiding in the common law tradition as it was presented today. You said that it has helped the courts travel on roads that they were already inclined to travel. But I think an important feature of those roads is that Conor quite likes the courts travelling those roads, and it's the outcome that he likes, and we need to measure that against roads that we might not be so inclined to like the courts travelling, like, for example, the fetishisation of property rights, for example, is another area where the Human Rights Act might help the courts along a road that the common law is already inclined to travel. So there's the first thing. And the second thing was on a slide early on about judicial review, and this is the judicialisation argument. So Conor supports the Human Rights Act, or doesn't oppose it so vociferously anymore, on the grounds that his worries about judicialisation of politics have not come to pass. But there's a real divide between how that argument plays out today and how he presented it 20 years ago. Today, he talks about courts versus experts, and the key battleground here is that, yes, proportionality has been introduced, but the courts have done so aware of their institutional constraints, the relative institutional competencies. But, and I say it was Conor's argument 21 years ago, this is still a live argument. People object to the Human Rights Act, not because of courts versus experts, but because of courts versus government, courts versus the legislature. And not just because of the fight between Wednesbury and proportionality, but also because of a generalised sense that some things aren't fit for courts. And so we've all just seen Conor welcome the development, the way judicial review developed. But what he welcomed was much narrower than the problem he articulated 20 years ago. So there's a couple of ways that I worry that it was less principled. So next I'm going to ambush Conor with some of his own writing. It's the one that I've got it with me that I happened to have to hand when he sent me the paper yesterday. His attack on the Human Rights Act when it was first introduced, he said, and I think this was true, was based on an underlying understanding of the role of courts in a representative democracy. And he worried that a future as the executive arm of the judicial branch would be demeaning for governments. And he warned that the ILHRU must not become a substitute for politics. But in the praise for the Human Rights Act we've just heard, it was praising the Human Rights Act for substituting for politics in, for example, the question of criminal procedures. So I share the distaste, just to be clear, for things like control orders and the things that the courts have pushed back against. But I think what's happened is the courts have done a job that we approve of, rather than the original argument that this isn't their job at all has dropped away. So one possibility is that I'm right, but it's okay. What we've heard is an unprincipled defence of the Act, but who cares? At least it's a defence of the Act. Maybe you think that we don't need to defend the Act in a principled fashion. Any defence will do if we like it at all. Another possibility that I hope is the case is that I'm wrong, and that hidden in there somewhere is a principled defence of the Human Rights Act. And the reason that I'm worrying about this isn't just to have a go at Conor today. The reason I'm worrying about it is that the necessary audience for defences of the Human Rights Act is not me. Okay? The necessary audience for defences of the Human Rights Act is the people who are attacking it, and who may have a majority in government to attack it in 6 weeks' time. And I worry that they won't be impressed by the argument that Conor likes the outcomes that we've had under the Human Rights Act. That they won't like the argument that the Human Rights Act is brilliant because it enables courts to push back against legislative attempts to make criminal procedures more onerous for defendants. That's their whole problem with the Human Rights Act. And that's why my challenge is there a principal defence here? You say you kind of changed your mind and you don't like to admit you have, but if you haven't changed your mind about the underlying principles, is it possible to derive a defence of the Human Rights Act from them? That's to just go beyond just outcomes. So those were my initial thoughts on the paper. There's loads going on there that I've not even touched on, and there's probably lots of other people who want to talk, but that's my initial
Can we jump in
reaction.
for like a minute, because that's really interesting. Thank you, Anthony, very much. I tried to get in real quick before you got too much of a round of applause there. I can revive my old I didn't change my mind point. Basically, Parliament can still do what it likes. If we had a left-wing Labour government, it can abolish private schools, it can renationalise the railway, it can do all that stuff, whatever it wants. All it has to do is make clear it's doing it. And that means it'll be Section 4, Declarations of Incompatibility, and the stuff will be protected by Section 4.2, whatever it is, or 3.2, 6.2, 4.4, and they carry on. And what they say is, I hear you about the Declaration of Incompatibility, I'm not going to do anything. And the Human Rights Act is clear as a bell, you don't have to. And I asked David Blunkett once, who was Home Secretary at the Belmarsh time, what would you have done? He had to resign the day before the Belmarsh case. He said, I'd have re-legislated it, totally entitled to. So I am robustly restating the capacity of politics to control the courts. They have to explain it. They have to engage with the public in explaining why they are choosing to take what the judges call human rights hits. They have to present under Section 19 legislation to Parliament which they admit is a human rights problem. You have to, in other words, de-escalate the moral strength of the language of human rights and turn it into another political contribution. But you can. And so the reason why it worked for me then was because it did not give the courts the Canadian, American, German, Irish power to do whatever you want. And so I was really critical of Jackson, which says, oh, vaguely, the constitutional order means we can strike down acts of Parliament. And I was really supportive of Miller-Cherry, because if you look at Miller-Cherry, parliamentary sovereignty and accountability to Parliament. So I see it as Parliament reinforcing, not subverting. So that's the kind of effort to get the balance right. However, of course, the giveaway was my treatment of the case of R versus A. I don't like that one, so I'm critical of that one. But how can I love some, like love Lord Wolfe and hate Lord Steyn? So I'm obviously picking and choosing. Here's the answer. I think what we saw with the sentencing cases and the Belmarsh stuff and so on was what we might call proto-populism. Populism has become very, very fashionable, and people are doing things in order to curry that kind of favour. But the judges struck out against that. And I like that because I do ultimately, I think, believe in the protection of disliked, marginalised people. That's a choice. And an exception to that was the Act of Parliament that actually recalibrated the legal process in favour of women complainants in rape cases. And they brought that up as well. But I can deduce that the cases that are attacking minorities or dislike people and so on in the name of kind of currying popular appeal are the cases I disapprove of. The cases that seek to continue making social progress are cases I approve of. So I can pick and choose. However, I am ultimately a social democrat. There's a book in honour of Keith Ewing, my great friend and co-author, coming up, called The Constitution of Social Democracy. And I've got a chapter in it about this whole thing you've talked about, Adam. And I think times have changed since 20 years ago. And I think the basic structure of our system of government could well disappear. And I don't think we appreciated that 20 years ago. That we would have representative government, we'd have an independent rule of law, and we'd have a basic fundamental assumption that people mattered. I think things are changing. I think it's it's sort of possible that none of that will matter. And so I have become more conservative. But I think, and this is the thrust of what I said in your book, I think I'm reacting to changed circumstances around me.
Right. Shall we take, I'm always mindful of time, but let's start with 3 questions and then we'll see how it goes. Would like to ask Michelle first? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Conor. Thanks for letting me go first. I really enjoyed that. And I just want to push back a little bit as well on the principal point, but also going a bit deeper back into the history of the European Convention, because the Belmarsh case, in a way, is, we have a short memory on Belmarsh, and the short memory is that that was a wonderful case and a wonderful result for the men that were detained. The slightly longer history is that they were detained for years in these terrible conditions, and Keith Ewing makes this point, the court decision was too late. But the longer history is that it's the European Convention on Human Rights that provides the mechanism by which those guys got into the prison in the first place via states of emergency provisions. And the European Court of Human Rights has been absolutely dreadful on those provisions, and the British got that provision into the convention in the first place. So human rights law facilitated their detention in the first place. So that's our human rights part of the problem. And on that case as well, the Belmarsh case, the decision is a good one, but did the Human Rights Act make that decision, that legislative decision easy? The politicians sit back on their laurels and think, well, the courts will deal with this later, because you said at some point during your presentation that, you know, this is the politicians making the legislation, but it's not. This was the state, this was the executive in Parliament. So I think we have to think about that point. This isn't the courts versus the legislature, it's the courts versus the executive. So that's the one point, is Belmarsh a much more complicated question, and it just leads me to a second point, because then we move on from thinking about Belmarsh into control orders and TPIMs, but control orders were rationalised by the courts. They didn't, and they tinkered away at them, and TPIMs are dreadful. They only affect a small number of people. But that brings me to my final point, which is they only affect, I think it's 8 people that have TPIMs applied to them at the moment, but they are so onerous on those individuals, and the Courts and Human Rights Act allows for those. And the very idea of rights, to come back to a principal point, for me is something a little bit more inspiring than sort of bringing the common law to its natural conclusion. It should be about, you know, individuals having some power against the state. So I just want to see if you have any ideas on that. The individual, the state, and human rights is part of the problem.
Or you can we take 2 more questions?
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Conor. Enjoyed your paper. I'm just very interested in your points in response to Adam about the future Labour government that's trying to nationalise, and they get a declaration of incompatibility against them. And as you rightly say, you know, they should resist that and say, well, it's just a declaration, we can ignore it. What would you advise a future Labour Prime Minister in those circumstances when you get the kind of the pushback that we saw at Miller? You know, the judges are independent, you shouldn't disregard the judgments of our courts, and therefore, even though it's a declaration of incompatibility and technically, legally, you don't have to comply. Surely there will be a lot of cultural, legal pressure for the independence of the judiciary and that decision to be respected. So I'm interested in your thoughts in how you would advise a Labour leader at that point.
Okay, and one question from one of our LLM students.
Thank you very much. I ended beautifully with the question that whether or not human rights will survive, and even if it does not survive, it will leave behind its children to continue. Is it possible to throw light on some of these children for future human rights activists to make it as a basis to begin and build on?
Okay. Shall I do that? Was it Michelle?
Yeah.
Yeah. There is this big problem. I wrote a book called Liberty and Security, which is really about this, actually, a few years ago, of the legitimization of power through the language of human rights, inescapably. My friend Martin Loughlin at LSE thought better to have the few guys interned by the active state than to have a complicated system of legalization which expands to fit the bill generated by the law. The best example of this, actually, is the way in which, in a reaction to a case in Strasbourg, we've now got all of those deprivation of liberty orders. and an informal way of getting one or two people treatment has now become a massive regime. So I'm with you. TPIMs and control orders, the same. What has been interesting about TPIM's control orders in Belmarsh, as against deprivation of liberty orders, has been how few there have been. And that has been because the values of liberty, I shared a platform last week with the former head of MI5. The values of liberty seem to have controlled the exercise of discretion, not the law, not the law. It's a huge worry. And I agree with you. And you have to work out whether you're prepared to take the risk of legitimization or do without the language. And I think it's just a hard call. On the Belmarsh one, it's very interesting, you know, because I'm going to make an observation about the power of the legislator. The 2001 Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Bill did not contain some safeguards. The executive did not want them. They were imposed. Among them was a requirement for a committee of privy councillors to review the operation of what was Part 4, the detention part, within a certain time frame. The matter was, of course, litigated by the detainees. The High Court found in favour of the government. Lord Wolfe in the Court of Appeal, big human rights guy, found in favour of the government. So far, so good. And by December 2002, an obscure former Secretary of State for Health under Margaret Thatcher, Tony Newton, who nobody remembered, issued this coruscating Privy Councillor's report, which basically said, the Emperor has no clothes. This is rubbish. Why are we detaining foreigners when, if anything, we should be detaining either nobody or everybody? And the House of Lords decision, the famous, much celebrated one, was in a space mainly created by a committee which had been created by parliamentarians. And people forget that, and they don't remember the other, you know? On Mike, was it Mike? Mike's point, the reason many of us opposed human rights was because we used to have a government that aspired to the kind of heavy lifting that would be required to achieve equality. One of the reasons why it's been so lacking in controversy from the left has been the left has done nothing. Tony Blair, whom I greatly admire and was strongly supportive of, played always within the rules set by power, judging that that was the best way to achieve incremental change. Mr. Corbyn has a different view. It is set. So were he to win, he would probably not do what Stephen Byers did, which is pull certain decisions on railways because of the cost of removing privatisation, for example. But he has already got extraordinarily considerable enemies in tackling that level of entrenched power. So added to his list would be the Conservative Party's recovery of their deep commitment to human rights, which they had in the 1970s. Lord Sumption's political boss, Keith Joseph, Lord Hailsham, they'll be back at it, saying how important human rights are. And they'll be celebrating the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, to which various rich people will be taking cases intending to enjoy success. In the early 80s, even the thought of removing VAT, that is tax exemptions from private schools, provoked an opinion by two of the leading barristers in the country, with a forward by Lord Scommon saying it would be a breach of the convention. So it's a considerable enemy, and they'll also have to deal, as I say, with the Strasbourg cases. The trivial answer is he'll have bigger problems on his in-tray than the legal critiques. And I hope that he is being advised to really engage in cultural change and not just fight from within a bunker. Because if he fights from within a bunker, he'll end up marooned and isolated, shouting about the way in which he's being misrepresented by the press, and it will not last long. So I'd hope he'd do, I hope he's doing what Tony Blair did, summoning intellectuals, having open meetings. I went to one in Kings in 1995, where Tony Blair got a whole bunch of academics in. David Miliband organised it for him. I hope, I don't know that he is, because I'm certainly not in it, that he's building intellectual capital for the fight. My impression is that he's not, but he would need to. And it's not about getting rid of Alistair Campbell, or about sacking this person or that person, or withdrawing this person's position within the Labour Party, or winning this little battle in the National Executive Committee. That's a habit of a lifetime that needs to be unlearned. It's about more than the Labour Party and winning within the Labour Party, a point about which I feel very strongly. So I'm worried about that one. The children, of the human rights thing, I think the courts won't willingly give up many of the habits that they have secured through interpretation under the Human Rights Act. And there are cases where you think they could willingly kind of transfer it to the non-human rights ordinary common law arena. Because there's quite a lot of cases built up now where the judges are saying, even without human rights law, I don't like this, I don't like that. And I've always been opposed to that, the case of Jackson I mentioned earlier. But it might be that cases like Nicklinson, big long case on assisted dying, are practice runs for simply asserting a judicial power over statute. In which case, repeal of the Human Rights Act could produce the very subjugation of Parliament that the Act was designed to prevent, but which its critics thought it achieved.
Oh, thank you so much. I can hear your train actually.
What time is it not? What time?
It's 1/4 past.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Adam went on far too long.
So I think we cannot afford going for another round of questions at this stage because there is a taxi waiting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So just please join me in thanking both Conor and Adam for their contributions, and it was lovely having you, and thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much for the invitation. Thank you.